Jason, quick question for you. Who initially predicted that 2.2 million Americans could die from the coronavirus?
That was Mr. Neil Ferguson.
Neil Ferguson. And where does Neil Ferguson work?
Well, people say the UK, but that is actually the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute for Disease and Emergency Analytics.
So Neil Ferguson is the director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute. Well, who do you think funded the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute? Who do you think just bought 100,000 cars from them before the pandemic, before the crisis? Who bought 100,000 vans from the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute?
Right, vans, I would assume that they're shipping things, so...
Amazon!
Yeah.
And this was reported by the McKinsey consulting firm. What? But not before I can expose the truth about Neil Ferguson, the man who falsely reported that 2.2 million Americans could die from the coronavirus.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. One of the reasons that most of the Western world embraced unprecedented mass quarantines this spring was due to the work of a single man, a man you may have not have heard of. He's a British academic called Neil Ferguson. Ferguson is a professor at a college in London, but he's also something of an international celebrity. He is best known for his dire predictions about pandemics. Ferguson seemed especially panicked by the Wuhan coronavirus. At one point, he suggested the coronavirus might be comparable to the Spanish flu of 1918, the pandemic that killed up to 100 million people. On February 28th of this year, as the disease spread throughout Europe, Ferguson publicly endorsed the Chinese model of quarantine, specifically. Now, keep in mind that as Ferguson spoke the words you're about to see, videos were circulating on the internet showing police in Wuhan throwing screaming citizens into the back of panel trucks and driving them to some unspecified internment somewhere. Ferguson must have known that the Chinese government's response in Wuhan was extreme and utterly inhumane. He endorsed it anyway. That's how serious Neil Ferguson was about this virus.
One has to adopt the sort of community measures which have been adopted, particularly in places like Wuhan and China, where you try to reduce contacts between people in the community. So the sorts of measures which are important are, first of all, if anybody has any sort of respiratory disease, cold, anything, stay at home until those symptoms are fully resolved.
Seems like kind of a reserved academic, and all of a sudden he's endorsing the Wuhan response. Leaders around the world paid attention to this. They took Ferguson's advice and locked down their entire populations. The British government asked Ferguson to help design its quarantines as a member of the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, SAGE. Ferguson was happy to help shut down the entire United Kingdom, but it turns out he wasn't that interested at all in participating in it personally. Today, the Telegraph newspaper reported that Neil Ferguson ignored his own lockdowns. While the rest of London stayed trapped indoors, indeed the rest of the country, Ferguson repeatedly invited his married mistress over to his apartment for sex. And then perhaps most striking of all, he was infected with the coronavirus at the time. Neil Ferguson became sick and tested positive in mid-March. We know this because he said so publicly at the time. Not long after that, he invited his mistress over. By doing this, he exposed her to a deadly virus. He also exposed her husband and her children back home.
Jason, on today's show, we interview McKinsey's Tim Koller about how to measure and manage the value of companies during a pandemic.
Okay.
Shakababa.
Get ready to enter the Thrive Time Show.
We started from the bottom, now we hit. We started from the bottom, and we'll show you how to get here. Started from the bottom, now we hit. We started from the bottom, now we hit.
We started from the bottom, now we're on the top. Teaching you the systems to get what we got. Colton Dixon's on the hooks, I break down the books. Z's bringing some wisdom and the good looks. As the father of five, that's why I'm alive. So if you see my wife and kids, please tell them hi. It's the C&Z up on your radio. And now 3, 2, 1, here we go.
We started from the bottom, now we hit. We started from the bottom.
Yes, 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 and yes. Thrive Nation, on today's show, we have a very special guest. Tim, welcome on to the Thrive Time Show. How are you?
Thank you very much. How are you, Clay?
Well, I am excited to interview with you here today. I understand that you are the author of a new book here called Valuation, Measuring and Managing the Value of Companies, the 7th edition, where you're talking about a very timely subject right now. How do you properly evaluate a company during the coronavirus? So I'm excited to get into it with you. What inspired you to write the book?
Well, this is the 7th edition of the book, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So we update it periodically because there's always something new happening in the world that we want to write that we need to talk about. So, for example, obviously much of the book was written before the coronavirus, but there's a lot of things we can apply to that. But in the last several years, a lot of topics that affect companies' valuations have come up. For example, the focus on ESG, the business roundtables, discussion about corporate purpose, companies talking about digital initiatives. Those are the kind of things that are quite topical these days. So we're always updating the book to reflect what's going on in the environment as we learn more about what matters and how both investors and companies can better sort of either understand the value of their companies or make better investment decisions.
Now, we have a lot of listeners out there that might not be familiar with you and your background. Could you explain what your role is at McKinsey at this point?
Sure. I'm a partner at McKinsey's Stamford, Connecticut office. I've been with McKinsey for over 33 years, focusing on anything related to value creation and corporate strategy. So I work with clients on corporate strategy, mergers and acquisitions, in communicating with investors, and I do a lot of research and publications, including all 7 editions of the book over the last 30 years.
Now, could you explain in maybe layman's terms of what McKinsey does? Because we have about 500,000 listeners, many of which own businesses, and I think McKinsey is like a mysterious company. You know what I mean? It's like we all know the name McKinsey, but maybe people aren't familiar with exactly what McKinsey does. Could you share what McKinsey does?
Sure. At its essence, at McKinsey, we help our clients improve their performance over the long term. So whether it is most of our clients are companies. So our objective there is to help them improve their performance either by choosing better strategies, by improving their operations, by better sales and marketing, by better innovation. We also work with nonprofits and government organizations to improve their efficiency and the impact that they have on the world.
With McKinsey, you guys, I feel like, you do so many things at McKinsey. Can you share because you've been there a long time, what was your first job working at McKinsey?
My first assignment working at McKinsey was to help a company look for some acquisition opportunities that were related to what they were doing and where they felt they could add some value. So we were looking for what kinds of businesses could they get into that would complement what they already done, where they can improve the performance of those businesses.
So now that we're going into today, April, May of 2020, how has the coronavirus panic and the shutdown of entire states and certain industries impacted how companies now are valued?
Well, it's interesting that you asked that question because the markets, the stock markets, first of all, the stock markets are not of one mind, right? The market is interaction of different investors with different perspectives, right? For every buyer, there's got to be a seller, et cetera. So even as the market goes up and down, there are buyers and sellers with different opinions. But I think it's also useful to understand that not every company and every industry has declined at the same rate. Different industries have behaved very differently during the last 3 or 4 months as we've gone through this crisis. So the market has been able to discern which companies are actually in the short term are actually going to benefit and therefore probably long term won't change that much in value. Which companies are going to be the most hurt, which industries are going to be the most hurt. Those have gone down the most, not surprisingly. So the market's been fairly discerning as a result. But on the other hand, while it is discerning, there's tremendous amount of uncertainty out there that affects every company. We don't know how long the recession that will come about will last and how deep it will be, how global it will be. And that's one of the reasons why you see the volatility. And depending upon your perspective, if you're a corporate executive, you should probably just focus on your business and not worry too much about what the stock market is doing, because there's not much you can do to influence it right now. Most of it's driven by your industry. If you're an investor, you do see plenty of investors out there looking for opportunities of companies that will be able to come out of this situation stronger, or at least in a strong position relative to their peers. So it creates, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of opportunities, and it is going to change the way some industries operate over the longer term.
On the McKinsey website, you guys have really well-written content, and one of the things that to me just jumped out that it seemed like perfect timing was, or maybe a good guess or whatever, but it was reported here on the McKinsey site. It says both Ford and Amazon announced in 2019 that they were investing hundreds of millions of dollars in the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab. Apparently, they have purchased 100,000 of these electric vehicles, 100,000 vehicles. And it was talking about, how does McKinsey advise companies like Amazon to buy these vehicles, or is this something you guys report on, or how does that work? Because it seems like you guys always have your finger on the pulse of what's happening.
Well, typically when we're publishing something about something, it's already in the public domain. So we don't publish anything that's not in the public domain, and obviously can't contact because of can't comment because of client confidentiality on individual transactions. That said, those would, we do help clients with important strategic decisions and help clients to think about sort of what are the changes that are taking place in the world that will affect their businesses and what they can do to get ahead of that. And that may involve things related to, for example, we have a large practice related to climate change and how that affects companies and what they can do about it. So we might help companies to think about how do we anticipate the impact of climate change on their industry, on that company, and what are the actions that they should be taking strategically to deal with that. It could be moving towards electrification. It could be moving away from some of their core businesses that are going to be damaged by climate change. There's a whole range of things that we might help companies with to think about sort of the impact of climate change and how that should affect the strategies they're pursuing.
How do you think the average small business owner should be reacting to this coronavirus economy? What practical action steps would you encourage the plumbers out there, the dentists, the doctors, the lawyers, a lot of the small business owners that listen to this show?
Yes, how businesses should react really depends on their starting point, if you will, and how the situation is affecting them, and that varies quite a bit. For small businesses in particular, we think that liquidity is typically number one, right? You have to survive this uncertain period of time. We don't know how long things will last, right? So one of the most important things is to make sure that you have liquidity that you need lined up, whether you've applied for government programs, whether you've tapped out your credit lines, et cetera, so that you can make sure that you can survive through this period of time. Working with perhaps your suppliers, working with your customers to help you survive throughout this period of time. We also think it's absolutely essential that you think about the well-being and safety of your employees and your customers. We've talked to many people about this. Consumers, suppliers, all have long memories about how they're treated. And if now's the time to develop and maintain your reputation of being a good employer, a good provider to your customers, a good customer to your suppliers, et cetera. So focus on those kind of things. Combine that with liquidity to make sure you can get through this thing as well as you can. It's obviously going to affect different businesses differently, but you you need to sort of be prepared. You need to be flexible. You need to be creative. Think about what are the things. Are there ways that as we come back that you can encourage customers to come back to your business by the actions that you take in order to so that they feel safe coming back as customers and your employees feel safe coming back to work. Those are the main things you really need to focus on, because if you don't, first of all, you have to get through this, and secondly, you need to make sure you have a strong reputation coming through this so that your customers and employees will want to work with you going forward.
Paul Hood, you're a CPA.
I am.
And you help people evaluate businesses all the time, evaluate the companies and determine a fair sales price. You help companies do mergers and acquisitions. And
I do.
You've helped a lot of people do that. What question do you have for Tim about evaluating companies here during this coronavirus economy?
Well, I've got a question, Tim, and it's good to talk to you, my friend. And we have a fairly large CPA financial planning firm, and we help a lot of clients. And one of the focus right now is the EIDL program through the SBA. And we're really not getting very good information. So my question to you would be, you know, it appears that it's basically a normal underwriting, except for you don't go through the bank, you go through directly with the SBA. But if a business in today's world went in and tried to borrow money, but they've been shut down for 3 or 4 months, and there's uncertainty on how they're going to recover, a lot of times the lender will not loan them money. And so do you have any advice on how to present, or based on your experience, how to present a valuation on a business that effectively has gone from good performer to basically shut down for 2 or 3 months, given that it appears that the SBA underwriting is going to be normal underwriting? Do you have any comments or recommendations for businesses that, like you say, they need the liquidity, and so right now that liquidity is tied to the SBA, and do you have any insight on that?
I don't have any specific expertise dealing with the SBA or those kinds of things. If I back up and think more broadly about, in general, what you would focus on in a time like this, right? I think this is a time when you have to go back to sort of first principles and focus on, what is the business? What's the best case I can make for what the business is going to look like when we come out of this, so that I'm prepared when we come out of this with sort of a good plan. I can be very specific about, when we do reopen, how we're going to reopen, how we're going to attract customers, those kinds of things, so that I can quickly get back on track and start to generate revenues and cash flows.
Okay.
I don't have any sort of specific expertise though in working with the SBA that would be helpful beyond that.
Yeah, well, the bottom line, though, is you're saying, and we teach what we find as small to medium-sized businesses, they don't have a measuring process. It's kind of like a person's trying to lose weight, but they never step on the scale. They don't have the numbers that they need to know on a daily, weekly basis. And so we teach them to be proactive, to actually, plan ahead instead of looking backwards. And so the same principle would apply. Here's what, I'm hearing you say is, okay, what is your game plan as if you were a startup? What is, what's your 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year projection, and why do you feel like you can do that, instead of just sitting back and just saying, they can't give me this handout. So good information.
Tim,
that's a very good way of summarizing it, by the way, because I think that's exactly the right thing. You're starting just like you are like a startup right now, right? Because you are shut down, but you do have experience that you can draw on as to what your operations look like, and you should be putting together a plan. You should be having a fairly detailed outlook on your liquidity, how many weeks you can survive under different scenarios. So be as prepared, be as knowledgeable as possible about the situation and how it's affecting you, and how you think you're going to be able to come back when the economy starts to reopen.
I have one final question for you, because I really do enjoy reading the content on the Mackenzie website. where do you guys, I mean, is this like a daily blog that you guys, how would you describe the content you guys have? Because it's always so accurate. It's so spot on. I mean, it is great.
Well, we have excuse me, we have a sort of a COVID publishing task force which coordinates all these things. Since this has happened, there's been a tremendous demand from our clients and public in general about what's going on and what it means for the economy, for different industries, different other constituencies that might be affected, and so we've got people, sort of many practitioners, myself included, saying, well, how does this affect my area of expertise? And we encourage people to write about it, and then it goes through a big editing process. We have like over 15,000 employees around the world, and we have people with expertise in everything from myself in sort of say valuation and strategy and working with investors. So I wrote an article about where we interviewed investors and said, what do investors think companies should do? Right? People who are involved in climate change will be talking about that. People who are involved in helping companies with liquidity and restructuring will be writing about that. People who are involved in our McKinsey Global Institute, who think more about the economy as a whole and what's happening, they'll be writing about that. We have industry experts analyzing what's going to happen to the auto industry, what's going to happen to the retail industry, and writing about that. So it's very dispersed to experts in their various fields, and then we bring it all together to publish on the website.
Brother, I appreciate you so much for joining us today. And for the listeners out there who are on the fence about picking up the newest edition of your book, who should pick up a copy of this book in your opinion?
And who should pick up a copy of our book? Our book is really, and one of the reasons it's been successful for over 30 years now, and it's sold over 800,000 copies, is that it appeals to a broad audience, right? It brings together strategy, it brings together finance, it brings together accounting, and in a very accessible way, so that you start off the book and you can understand, how do companies create value? What does it mean to create value? What can managers do to increase value? That's a big chunk of the book. Another part of the book is much more technical, which you don't need to read if you're not interested in it. So if you're a senior executive, you might skip the more technical parts. There's parts on actions that you can take. How do you think about planning and performance management? How do you think about mergers and acquisitions? So it covers quite a range, and so it's really we think of it as more of a cookbook rather than a novel, in the sense that you can read the parts that are most relevant to you, but it brings together the best of sort of strategic thinking, financial theory, accounting, the latest trends in the world into one place. We think it's pretty broadly applicable. It's used by a lot of professors in their business school classes. It's used by investment banks to teach their bankers. It's also used by senior executives to get an education about sort of how companies create value and how the markets work.
Tim, I appreciate you so much for joining us today. You are just a powerhouse of knowledge, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Have a good day yourself.
Take care. And now, without any further ado, 3, 2, 1, boom!